Welcome to UO Today. I'm Paul Pepis, Director of the Oregon Humanities Center. My guest today is Tze-Yin Teo, Assistant Professor of Comparative Literature at the University of Oregon. Teo's research interests include comparative and transnational modernisms, translation, literary theory, and the literary and philosophical dimensions of the environmental humanities. Teo began teaching at the U of O in the fall of 2015 after earning her doctorate in comparative literature at Emory University. She is completing her first book, tentatively titled The Rest of the World, Weak Translatability Across Modernist Literatures, U.S. and China. Thank you for coming on the show.
Thank you for having me.
Among your areas of interest are comparative and transnational modernisms. Tell us what you mean by comparative and transnational modernisms.
Sure. So previously, modernism and modernist studies have quite frequently been wedded to a certain national model of definitions. And so I'm thinking particularly, for example, of American modernism, of British modernism, of a certain conglomerate known as Anglo-American modernism. And there already we begin to see that, in fact, modernism as an aesthetic movement has been constituted precisely through networks of influence and circulation between nations, between languages, and so forth. And so that's kind of what I mean by comparative and transnational modernisms.
How did you come to be interested in that? How did you come to that interest?
Well, as an undergraduate, I was an English major. And I did my undergraduate at the National University of Singapore, not in the United States. And there I was introduced, obviously, to the canon of English literature, both British and American. And so that was really where my very initial training began as a scholar, and sort of where I began to start thinking about literature. And so when it came to my doctorate, it was almost natural, I suppose, to sort of use that as my starting ground.
You also are someone who works in literary theory and translation studies. Mm-hmm. How'd you get there? What attracted you to those areas?
Well, that also, I guess, began with my training as an English major as an undergraduate. And in that time, I sort of fell into literary theory, as one does, just through taking classes, through meeting professors, and so forth. And for me, I think what I found so interesting and exciting about literary theory, and I'll get to translation in a second, mm-hmm. but what I found interesting and exciting about literary theory was the way in which it was able to take literature and expand its implications towards the philosophical, towards questions of, our own existences, how we interact with one another, and towards questions of, political import. So questions of community, questions of race, of gender, and so on and so forth. So that's what I found so exciting, is that it made literature very capacious and made the aesthetic responses that I had so much more important and exciting. And for translation, I sort of fell into that as well when I was doing my doctorate. And when I was sitting down to write my dissertation and to conceive of it, I went through a series of hoops and a series of questions that eventually sort of led me to the question of translation. And it's sort of very long and arduous journey, I think, before I got to this question of translation.
Okay, so we're talking about translation.
Uh-huh.
There's theories of translation, yes, on the one side, and then there's practices of translation. Yes. I assume you're interested in both the theory, yes, and practice of translation. Yes. So talk to me about the sort of parameters of the theoretical debates. What are some of the theories that are out there about how to do translation?
Sure. So some of the theories, and these are, I would hesitate to say prescriptive, mm-hmm, but certainly they are sort of, handed to you as one possible approach. Some theories include foreignizing. A foreignizing translation would be a translation that seeks to incorporate elements of the source language into the target language. Mm-hmm. So typically we understand translation as going from point A to point B, mm-hmm, source to target. And so a foreignizing translation might seek to incorporate elements of A into B.
So that might be, for example, foreign words or foreign references,
etc. So that might be one example. So to move into the sort of practical, well, I guess, so that would be one theoretical idea of how that might be done. And I'm interested particularly, though, in how, so if we follow this model, for example, and if in practice we were to sort of think about foreignizing as one possible way to go, then what might be further theoretical implications that we can derive from the act of foreignizing something? And these are the questions that I guess I'm trying to answer in my scholarship as well as my teaching.
So you're also a translator, yes?
Yes, I do translate for my own scholarly purposes.
So how would you characterize your own practice of translation?
Well, for me, I guess I'm very careful to work quite pedantically, I guess, with my own translations, simply because I come from it from a scholar's perspective, from an academic perspective. And I am very much writing with a monolingual Anglophone audience in mind, of course, and that's primarily the North American academia situation. And so for that reason, I'm very careful to not only think about translation in a discursive sense, so I might have very, very long translations for a single word, for example, almost a kind of commentary, but also I'm very careful to talk through the ambiguities and the possibilities that might be located just in, very few words.
So I study modernism,
Yes.
and I know that you are interested in the particular way in which Anglo-American modernism becomes interested in Chinese literature at the early 20th century. Very important person is this Ezra Pound, right? So Ezra Pound does these translations of Chinese poetry. They're in a book called Cathay. They're very famous. And Pound has no Chinese.
Yes.
He's working from the work of another scholar, Ernest Fenollosa. So for Pound, tell us what Pound's approach to translation is. He's translating in a different way than you just described.
Sure, of course. Pound is very interested. Well, first of all, I should say that Pound was actually a graduate student of comparative literature.
Yes.
A very, very long time ago, obviously. So well, I guess we have something in common there.
That's where the commonality is.
So yes, Pound is indeed very interested in Fenollosa and actually edited Fenollosa with a pretty heavy hand. And for Pound, his idea of translation was very free in many ways. He sort of took translation pretty much as a pretext. And for him, translation was an utterly creative practice that was very, very centered just on the translator himself, namely Pound, and so on and so forth. And so in many cases, the Chinese tradition served as a kind of springboard, perhaps we might say, as a kind of pretext in order for Pound to exercise his creative prowesses.
So not at all about trying to accurately.
No.
It was more about self-expression, and this was just another tool in his toolbox. So you are also, among your many areas of interest, you're also interested and study the environmental humanities.
Yes.
So tell me first, how do you define that category? What does that mean, the environmental humanities? And second, what's important about the way you do that work? How do you work with the environmental humanities? How do you define what the environmental humanities are? So how do you understand it, if we're at a cocktail party and I say, so what do? You say, I'm a comparatist, I work in environmental humanities, and I say, what's that, environmental humanities? What is that?
Sure. So if we understand environmental studies, perhaps, right, as the study of the environment, as the study of the ways in which humans and other elements of the environment interact, then we might be able to understand environmental humanities as having a certain kind of accent on the human, but also sort of probing into this idea of the human and probing into the role of the human, specifically as we construe him ecologically, as we construe her in this broader kind of ecological sense. And so for me, what's special about the way I might approach this is not only to put an accent on the human, but I think to sort of give it two charges. I think the first charge for me in the human and environmental humanities would be to think about the accountability that accrues to us as humans, the human species, in the Anthropocene, in a certain account of environmental damage, in a certain account of our responsibility throughout these very, very long histories of the environment. So that's the first charge that I would give. And the second charge that I would give to the term is a certain sense of the human as being not the only story, of our humanisms as being sort of actually very, very small and being only a very, very incomplete part of the story. And I think as good humanists, we probably need to be able to account for the fact that we're in fact not at the center of the universe. And so I guess one way to put that would be to say, well, I guess the human might be at once very large and very small. And I think that's what the environmental humanities can teach us.
Interesting. So you are also a faculty member in comparative literature. Yes. Your degree is in comparative literature. What's distinctive about comparative literature as a humanities discipline? What distinguishes it from other humanities disciplines? What's unique about it?
Yeah, I mean, it's interesting that you use the word discipline to characterize comparative literature. I mean, I often like to think that there is a certain kind of indiscipline or a certain kind of unruliness that is at the heart of our discipline, which, I mean, of course, we still call it a discipline, of course. And so so I think that would be the first thing, a certain kind of, I don't want to say disregard, but a certain kind of attempt at thinking outside the box, at revising inherited scripts that have been handed to us. That for me is, I think, the first and most important element of comparative literature. And then everything else kind of follows from there. When we put two things together, these two things obey different laws. Sometimes they come from different cultures, they come from different languages, and by putting them together, we get to revise both of them in very significant ways. And I think for me, that's probably the most interesting aspect of comparative literature.
When you say think outside the box, sure. Tell me what some of these boxes are that you're trying to think outside of.
Sure. So one box might be the idea of a national language, for instance. So I myself actually tried really hard to focus on a single national language when I was an English major, for example. And I found that to be a real exercise in self-discipline. I mean, that was genuinely quite difficult for me because I am so bilingual. So for example, that might be one box. And of course, these boxes exist for a reason. They exist because, we need ways of understanding what it is we know, and so on and so forth. So I'm not, trying to discount these boxes. I guess what I'm saying is that by thinking outside these boxes, we get to sort of change them a little bit, revise our narratives, and in a certain sense, create new knowledge in that way.
So that's a nice place to get for the next question, which is a transition from talking about disciplinarity and fields to talking about teaching.
Sure.
So say a little bit about how you bring to bear the things that we've just been talking about in the classroom. How do you see your job in the classroom as trying to help the students recognize and think outside of these boxes? What are some of the things that are your sort of core values as a teacher?
Sure. I think for me, my core values as a teacher are, in a sense, to sort of maybe not to think outside the box, but to sort of take existing narratives and to shift them a little bit, to sort of change paradigms and to rethink the ways in which we approach various things. So something that I always think about, because I teach in Comp Lit as well as in the environmental humanities, these two things are both, I think, roughly speaking, kind of interdisciplinary, or a kind of at least modes of inquiry that attempt to transcend boundaries and to sort of, push at boundaries a little bit, poke at them a little bit. So I guess one core value of my teaching for me would be to sort of poke at such boundaries a little bit. And quite often I get students, just because of the nature of my teaching, quite often I get students who are from different disciplines. I right now have some students who are from environmental studies. They are enrolled in a 400 level class, and this is their first time taking a literature class. And for me, I guess it's important, especially in teaching, to respond with generosity and to respond with curiosity. So, generosity in that I always require them to bring questions. I insist, in fact, that they bring questions.
About the reading that
about the reading, about how they might relate it to other classes, and so forth. And by sort of taking for granted that they have questions at all, I think that can be a very powerful gesture for them to understand that this is an ongoing mode of inquiry. And of course, curiosity, because I myself ask them a lot of questions. I'm one of those irritating professors who always ask questions. So,
you were just talking about the 400 level.
Yes.
Environmental humanities course that you're teaching, but you're also teaching a 300 level theories of poetry course, is that right? So are you, in that class, are you giving them poetry from multiple national traditions to read? So when you talk to them about the particular challenges and opportunities of translating poetry as opposed to other kinds of translations, what are some of the things that you talk to them about that sort of problem? I mean, I have a kind of, I'm an English prof, I have a kind of rule of thumb, which is when I'm teaching at the 400 level, I don't do translation. I don't teach them anything in translation because I can't push on the language in the way that I want. But what do you talk about in terms of translating poetry? Do you do poetry that has the two languages facing? Say a little bit about how you do that.
Okay, so for example, we might have a poem in the French, for example, and then I think what I've done is to have two translations alongside that poem. So one translation is a domesticating translation and one translation is a foreignizing translation. And in that way, students can sort of, who don't know the French, can sort of compare the translations themselves. And quite frequently, I think there are very strong differences that emerge. And I think these differences tend to be very instructive for them. They tend to get sort of even upset and defensive, like, this one's much better than the other one. And sometimes sort of little debates ensue about which one is better and so forth. And that, I think, actually gets to the heart of, what we think of as beautiful, what we think of as important, how we understand poetry, and so on and so forth. So that's just one strategy that I use.
That sounds fascinating to me. We've spoken a little bit about your teaching. You're finishing up your book, The Rest of the World: Weak Translatability Across Modernist Literatures. Tell us about that project.
Sure. So my project is interested in translation. It's interested in modernist literature, and it's interested in comparativity between two very specific languages, the English and Chinese languages. And in this project, I'm particularly interested in two contexts that might at first seem very different, might at first seem very far apart. And the first context is the Chinese context of Chinese modernism and modernity, in which translation becomes almost a kind of political instrument in the context of Chinese modernity. So very often Chinese translators would, without actually knowing very many European languages at all, would take some key ideas from European modernity and translate them into the Chinese in order to forge a certain kind of unique modern Chinese identity, a Chinese character, and so forth. So on one hand, translation as political instrument, let's say. And on the other hand, I'm interested, like we've just been talking about, in the Anglo-American context and in modernist writers who would very frequently take on translation as a kind of creative aesthetic practice, who very frequently sort of worked in a kind of aesthetic register. And I want to say that, like, in these two contexts, we have what seems to be a kind of opposition. On one hand, you know, very strong sort of political work being done by translation, and on the other hand, less so, or apparently less so, right? And so by putting these two things together, I want to say that what they have in common and what is continuous between them is this idea of translatability, this sort of probing at the idea of, like, what makes a text carryable across literatures. So across, I think, is the key word in the title that I've spent a lot of time thinking about and chewing over. And so what exactly sort of brings these two sides of the same coin into one coin?
Why is the translatability across that you're looking at weak? Weak in what sense?
Okay, yeah.
Or in what senses?
Yeah, sure. So like we've said previously, we said that, you know, translation we can understand as something that moves from A to B, right? Source to target and so forth. And here, especially in the scholarship of translation, we look at A and we look at B, right? We look at, you know, stuff that happens, like translations that ensue. We look at perhaps the quote-unquote original. We try and understand where this original came from and so forth. And what I'm interested in is, I guess, more like the space between there. And so I want to render the space in between into a kind of contested ground. I want to sort of think through what happens in this space between. And previously, people have talked about this contested ground as perhaps being key to ideas of the translator. So obviously, the translator might be one mediating figure from, you know, A to B, right? But I want to say that there are forces at work that cannot simply be accounted for by thinking about the translator. There are things like, you know, nations. There are things like state apparatuses. There are things like forces that the translator herself or himself or themselves are beholden to. And so this contested ground is what I'm calling weak, and I think that this weakness is charged with a certain politics that I'm still trying to explore.
Is there a strong translatability?
Sure. I mean,
what
like,
would that be?
Yeah, so I mean, in the text I study, for example, so this is one of the reasons I fell into translation. In the text I study, for example, quite frequently people will assert a strong translatability. So, for example, in Ernest Fenollosa's The Chinese Written Character as a Medium for Poetry, there's a throwaway moment in Fenollosa's account where he sort of talks about how, if you accept his account of the Chinese written character, how in fact it would be extremely easy to translate from Chinese to English and from English to Chinese. So that's his assertion, that there is, like, at least in his mind, a strong translator, like quite strongly he says it's very easy. And of course, like that relies on his entire account of the Chinese written character as a material force, as something that is, because it is material, can move across languages and so on and so forth, and he wants to locate that specifically in the English language. So that's one example, I guess, of strong translatability.
How do you understand the relationship between your scholarly work and your work in the classroom? Do you see that as are they mutually informing? How do you think about that?
Definitely mutually informing, and quite frequently I found myself taking stuff I say in the classroom and putting it into my book. So that's one helpful way to go about it. And more pertinently, though, I tend to construct my syllabi as narratives in themselves, as stories that you tell to your students, right? And that's how it sort of sticks a little bit more. So for me, for example, I've recently tried to add some text into my book, and I'm not sure if they fit into my book necessarily. So I told myself that I'll put it in my class, and if I can work it well into the narrative of my class, if I'm convinced, if the students are convinced, it's good. It's going to go in the book. So as a kind of testing ground, and it's wonderful just to be able to talk to these students about it, because it's so, it's like they don't reflect it back to you, they kind of refract it back to you. It's something slightly different when it comes back, and all of that always goes into the book. So
yes, I've always found the classroom to be a great learning space for teachers. The place that you just got to is a great place for me to ask you this question. So I'm the director of the Oregon Humanities Center. I pick up the New York Times, and I'm always reading about how, the death of the humanities, it doesn't help you. What's important about the humanities? Why do you study it? Why should we study it? What's good about it? What's important about it? Why does it matter?
I think for me, what's really important about the humanities, more so than understanding ourselves, more so than understanding other people, is the ways in which it can help us to ask questions, and it can help us to sort of think differently. So for me, the core of the humanistic enterprise, if you will, is the ability to ask questions and the ability to revise the cultural scripts that have been handed to us, like we've just been talking about. And that for me, I think is so valuable, and something that renders our senses of ourselves so broad and so different. And I think literature actually is a particularly capacious space for that, and it's a very, very generous space.
Wonderfully put. I couldn't agree more. We have about a minute and a half left.
Sure.
My last question.
Of course.
You're a new faculty member
Yes.
this year. It's your first year at the University of Oregon. What drew you to the University of Oregon?
Well, I think really just the opportunity to pursue the full range of my intellectual commitments. So the Department of Comparative Literature is one of the most well-regarded in the nation. The main journal for our field is right in the department. And also its focus on the environmental humanities, and that humanistic focus, I think, is very rare, I think, in the United States. So just a full range, and not to mention, of course, the wonderful students that I've been able to teach so far.
And the beautiful city of Eugene,
Yes,
which is a
absolutely
great green place.
and the evergreens and the coast.
Well, it's been really interesting talking to you today. It's been very enjoyable. Best of luck to you on the book. Keep up the good fight in the classroom.
Thank
Keep
you.
singing the praises of the humanities.
Thank you so much. It was good to be here.
I've been speaking with Tze-Yin Teo, Assistant Professor of Comparative Literature at the University of Oregon. She's completing her first book, The Rest of the World, Weak Translatability Across Modernist Literatures. Thanks so much for watching.